Monsieur le Président, conseillers, merci d'avoir invité les amis à comparaître aujourd'hui. Je vous présente Peter Lyman, associé principal chez Nordicity, et Nick Nanos, président du conseil de Nanos Research, qui m'accompagne pour répondre à toute question qui pourrait survenir au sujet des rapports de recherche que nous vous avons soumis le 5 novembre. On Thursday, Bob Cox, publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press and the chair of the Canadian Newspapers Association, penned a comment on last week's post-media cuts. Here's a quote. "The real crisis arising out of the massive media disruption of the past decade is communities are losing the journalists who tell people what's really going on where they live. Let's move the discussion away from the economic health of some newspaper companies to the democratic health of our communities and talk seriously about how we continue to get local news coverage." Our key messages today are: Canadians care about local TV, especially news. Without prompt action by your commission, many local stations, particularly in small and medium markets, will likely fail. Local TV news is essential to the democratic health of our communities. And in an environment of scarce resources, priority should go to independent stations in small markets. A key conclusion of the Nordicity Miller study is that Canada's local television system is at risk of major cutbacks and station closures. It projects that about half of Canada's private small and medium market stations could close by 2020. This would cause a permanent loss of 100 hours of local programming weekly and 910 jobs, unless you take action. The weakening or disappearance of local TV services in the order of magnitude projected in the study will sharply reduce the availability and quality of programming, especially local journalism, and this effect will be felt most strongly where local programming and journalism are already in the shortest supply, single-station markets. In contrast, large markets are often served by 3 or more private stations, as well as CBC SRC. The loss of a local station in a large market would be sad, a word that has recently entered the CRTC lexicon, but not fatal. The study also describes how United States local broadcasters do not face a similar fate because over the years, U.S. policymakers have introduced numerous measures to strengthen local TV, measures that your Commission and the Government of Canada have failed to implement. Your Commission's continuing assertion that there is sufficient funding within the system to ensure the creation of locally relevant and reflective programming flies in the face of the evidence, a form of denial that evokes the image of King Canute or an ostrich. At its very best, your proposed solution of new money for local TV coming from the existing BDU 5% contributions is a stopgap measure, that stopgap proposal that might delay small and medium market station closures. We do not discount the value of an interim emergency move, but much more is needed. Nordicity Miller confirms that a reallocation of BDU 5% contributions alone cannot plausibly redress revenue losses for all local TV in Canada. There is simply not enough money on the table to solve the problem. The study indicates that a 1.25% BDU contribution would fill the revenue gap otherwise projected for small and medium market stations by 2020. Extending this to all stations would require in excess of 3.5% of the BDU contributions, that is 70% of all the BDU contributions. We have proposed a number of key considerations. The Commission must maintain and secure a future for local TV and local news. Multiple local station closures would be unacceptable to Canadians and a damning legacy of your tenure at the CRTC's helm. Rob Peter to pay Paul support coming from existing BDU contributions is also unacceptable. There is a market reality that obligations on BDUs, or rather their customers, cannot be so onerous as to place BDUs at a material competitive disadvantage vis-à-vis competing and currently non-contributing over-the-top television players. A reasonable assessment of priority and sustainability suggests that what ought to emerge from this proceeding is new support for small and medium market stations, regardless of ownership, especially when a station is the only service in a given market, and relatively stronger support for independent small and medium market stations in comparison to their vertically integrated counterparts. If, notwithstanding advice to the contrary, you end up determining that additional local TV funding must be confined to the existing BDU contributions, large market stations should have lower priority for funding. The Commission and the new government should collaborate to create a policy environment that recognizes the needs and vital importance of local TV. An example would be to recognize the huge one-time hit for local TV stations channel relocation costs as a result of the former government's decisions on repurposing the 600 megahertz band. Although those decisions derive from and align with US-driven spectrum repurposing, the Americans have undertaken to reinvest a portion of the windfall to reimburse local TV broadcasters' capital costs, while the former Canadian government ignored our broadcasters' needs. We note that this is the kind of shovel-ready infrastructure investment that can kickstart the economy. The Prime Minister has said that his top priority is to grow the economy. In your decision, you should draw this opportunity to the government's attention. 16 months ago at the Let's Talk TV hearing, we told you, on local television, you must act. Our democracy, a well-informed citizenry that is engaged in public life, relies on it. Local stations will close if you don't, and we don't have to tell you the political consequences of that. Although we have seen significant cuts, dumb luck is most likely the reason that we haven't yet had a station closure. If you don't have preventive measures in place by the autumn of 2016, stations will close. Canadians and the new government will know whom to blame. Bell Canada, owners of the CTV and CTV2 networks, with more than 30 local stations, advised you during the Let's Talk TV hearing that it might close as many as 20 of those stations by September 2017. And the Coalition of Small Market Independent Television Stations wrote you almost a year ago saying that station closures were imminent, and in May you brushed them off. If this hearing's considerations are confined to a redirection of BDU contributions and not to an increase, any solution will be a Band-Aid, at best a temporary fix. We are cautiously optimistic that the new government may reverse some of the directions, formal and informal, set forth by the former government. We also believe that the government has the capacity and possibly the will to introduce new supports for the system, be they promised funds for public broadcasting, new mandated contributions from OTT or ISP players, changes to advertising expense deductibility, and some form of retransmission consent. You need not ignore policy priorities of the government of the day just because you are a judicial body. Over the past few years, you have demonstrated that you are sensitive to this need. C'est valable dans les deux sens. Si à partir de la prévue qui vous aura été présentée lors de ces audiences, vous êtes d'accord avec nous et d'autres qu'il faudra que le gouvernement assume le leadership pour assurer un avenir durable à long terme pour la télé locale, alors dites-le. Faites-le savoir au gouvernement. Mettez vos conseils dans votre décision. We'd be happy to respond to any questions.
Commissioner McDonald? Good morning, and thank you for your presentation. I'd like to start off by just asking a couple of questions about the survey, just so I understand it. When you were doing the survey, were you looking at the wider population, or were you looking at individuals who either frequently or occasionally view local news programming on their local stations?
The survey in the ridings, which was a random telephone survey of land and cell lines, focused on the market. In that particular case, the federal ridings. So it included all the people in the community.
And in any of your research, did you look at a difference between people's desire to get their local news programming on a conventional station versus on an over-the-top or online platform that they may be able to avail of local news from?
Mm-hmm. That wasn't the objective of the survey. The survey was to understand people's preferences related to local television news. And it's quite interesting because it's pretty clear that people support the principles and policies of the CRTC, and they trust the CRTC to make the right decision, and they also say that local television news is quite important.
And I'd agree with that. I'm actually not surprised to see the numbers that came out and people's commitment to local news. I'm just sort of wondering sort of how deep your surveys did go, because, you know, with news programming, more is better than some and some is better than none, and I'm just wondering if you looked at relative differences in any of the different ridings that may have had multiple news outlets, and what people's thought processes were there when there were more options.
Yeah, all the questions that we asked are presented in the report. There is no other content, so we didn't cover that content.
Okay, I didn't know whether
Commissioner
there was anything
McDonald, just
in addition to
for the record, the two surveys submitted are riding specific, and in none of those ridings are there multiple stations, to my knowledge, except in the case of Lillette, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup, where there are 3 stations, but they have a common ownership. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I don't live in any of these these 5 ridings, so I appreciate that overview. I guess just to start off, I'm going to have some questions specifically with respect to funding, because that obviously was a large part of your submission. But there are a few other issues that I also want to touch on as well. Without talking about what the proper funding mechanism may be, what are your organization's thoughts on the ability of community stations to be able to ramp up and be able to offer, you know, a significant quantity and quality of local news programming if there was a proper funding mechanism in place?
I may sound like a CRTC commissioner, but I just want to make sure I understand clearly what you mean by community stations.
They would be the local community stations, in many cases operated by the BDUs in the given area. Whether, you know, if additional funding were put in place, whether they could ramp up to offer daily news programming, for example.
Well, I was interested to hear your interchange with the folks from Eastlink yesterday. And one of you, it might have been Commissioner Molnar, asked the question about what if we changed the mechanism so that there wasn't a 1% subsidy for that purpose. Would you still do the programming? So I got the impression from Eastlink, and I suppose you may ask the other BDUs when they come here, that they like the situation of having what we see as 100% subsidy for community programming. So the issue of this hearing, I could go on and on about the capacity of community television to try to replace programming that is done by local television. But I would say that the problem appears to me in the real world to be to maintain what they are doing now rather than to expand it. And I would stress for you, and the words are in our brief, we believe that people care a great deal about journalistic standards, which requires professional talent doing the news. And there's a huge gap between that and amateur community news programming or access programming, Commissioner.
And would you say that's true of every region of the country? There are some communities, some areas that only have a community station right now, and they really don't have local programming that speaks to their community. It comes from, you know, a larger center. In the case of Atlantic Canada, oftentimes that comes out of Halifax, for example.
Well, I'm particularly impressed with community television and community radio, for that matter, in Quebec, just off the cuff. But these people do as well as they can what they're able to do, and I just don't feel it is seen by the public to be comparable to the services of the threatened local television stations. And also, when you look at the audience assembled by the community stations, often you'll find that the unit cost, the cost per viewer, is relatively high compared with local television, because in many cases they do not assemble a very large audience. And I say that in respect to community television, but just to not put it in to not make it seem like a solution to a problem when there's something much more important, as we have spoken, in play. I would also encourage you to continue to ask BDUs that appear before you whether they would accept a regime where your effective subsidy to community television was less than 100%.
In your submission, you mentioned, I'm going to read this because it is a quote, "Conventional stations continue to play a significant role in the lives of Canadians for the moment." And I found the "for the moment" to be an interesting phrase to include. Are you suggesting that you feel that the relevance of some of these conventional stations is going away as people perhaps migrate more towards getting their news content from other mediums?
We all live in the moment, don't we? Peter's study that you have seen projects forward to the year 2020. A colleague of mine was briefing people over at Heritage Canada on the outcome of another study that Peter did, and they were more interested in the second 5 years. And so we are preoccupied with the next 5 years, and we think you should be too. In fact, I think the chairman said in some document I reviewed recently that it would, 3 to 5 years was a reasonable time frame to look at, and I would encourage you to keep your eye on the next 5 years. I hope that's a response. Okay.
You mentioned actually in your oral presentation today that it would be sad if stations in larger markets close, but it wouldn't be fatal, and the priority obviously should be given to the small and medium markets where perhaps choice is more limited. I'm just wondering, can you speak to the proposal that Rogers has put forward whereby BDUs that operate community stations in the 3 largest centres, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, would scale back those operations in the larger centres and redirect those funds to over-the-air or community stations that operate in smaller markets?
Well, it's evidently self-serving, and I suppose most licensees coming before you are representing what they think is in their best interests. We're not in a position to advocate that. Rogers is on its own.
Okay.
We do cooperate with Rogers occasionally, but I can't tell you what it's about. Yeah.
Without sort of, I guess, speaking to any merits that may be in the Rogers proposal, if such a model was pursued, are there other markets that you think the Commission may want to look at other than Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, if there is a reallocation of funds based on geography to force some of those funds out into other areas, other than the three largest centres?
Well, you have various definitions of small, medium, and large, I think. I mean, one of them, in certain circumstances, is that small is below 300,000, and this isn't the municipality itself, but the listening area, the census metropolitan area. And then the second one is variously 500,000 or sometimes $1 million. For example, the local programming improvement fund of 2009, I think it excluded the 8 largest centers. It wasn't just Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. I guess Montreal was 2 of them because of the 2 language groups. So there are a variety of ways of cutting it. The essence of our advice today is the smaller, the more serious. And I would say, with respect to the, it would be sad if something happened in a big city. It's a loss of something in a huge reservoir of other things. And with limited resources, the focus should be on the loss of everything in a smaller community. Thunder Bay comes to mind, Peterborough, Rivière-du-Loup. In other words, the membership of the Smiths coalition is pretty representative of the places that are in the most trouble. Of course, there are places that I imagine are in trouble within the. Did we hear yesterday that 25 of Bell's local stations were losing money? I have a recollection of hearing that. I was listening on a computer in some hotel room. Yeah.
So in your intervention, you mentioned certain steps that have been taken in the U.S. by the regulators to, I guess that have resulted in those stations being in a different position than some of their Canadian counterparts, things like blackout programming and retransmission consent. But you say that those decisions have been the reason that the Canadian system is in a different situation, but you stop short of advocating for similar measures in Canada. Can you speak a little bit more about what has been done south of the border and your viewpoints on how or if that would make sense in the Canadian market?
Could we do that in a 2-part way? That Peter, who has expertise on that topic from his study, might speak about the American scene, grosso modo, and then I could follow up to respond.
As a Canadian, of course. I think the U.S. has had quite a different tradition of local broadcasters being protected and served quite well in a variety of ways, which is very hard to replicate exactly in Canada. I mean, the form of retransmission consent was fought through the courts in the American system to enable local broadcasters to, in effect, either barter or obtain funding, bartering by getting access to programming and so on, that enable them to have their own services, informally specialty services of the local nature. So that, along with the blackout provisions of programming that they had the rights to, and the distant signals being prevented from bringing in local from other jurisdictions, other markets. So all that evolved in a way that I think if you unpack it, it would be difficult for Canada to kind of replicate it. But as was pointed out in the submission, there was the opportunity of the Commission, and the Commission sought, of course, legal advice, or went before the courts and found that it was ultra vires. They couldn't make a decision in that respect. And that was, I guess, most related to retransmission consent. So that was Canada's way of, at that time, to try to rectify a situation of financing for local broadcasters. You could revisit it, I'm sure, but it would require actually Parliament to make some other decision.
And Peter's said it all, but I just to wrap that, that was the sense of the last 100 words or so of my brief oral introduction. We are advocating collaboration between the Commission and the government, which can be done while still respecting your statutory situation. And we have reason to believe, I struck out a few words here, based on good intelligence, and that we're not intelligent, but we have reason to believe that there is a new openness. I mean, a lot has changed in Ottawa 3 months ago, and so those are subjects that ought to be moved on, and we will be active on the political front doing that too. But it would be very helpful if the Commission, noting that certain things were possibly beyond its immediate jurisdiction but useful, communicated that to the government. There's nothing really preventing you from putting such a paragraph into a decision that might come out of the policy reflections of this hearing.
Okay, thank you. In your oral submission, and again in the questions you've answered today, you expressed support for small and medium markets. And yesterday when we were here, we heard a presentation from Bell that would see funding taken away from various different elements, community TV among them, to create a new local news fund that various stations could access to support, offering more news programming and diversity of voices in the market. And I'm just wondering if you could perhaps give us your thoughts on the proposal that was made yesterday.
Well, and the proposal made yesterday is not completely different from the input that Bell gave you on November 5th. Just taking it as a whole, I mean, like Rogers, Bell has an interest to protect, and that's perfectly legitimate. And so we have come to this hearing trying to contribute to a sense of what are the possibilities, what are the things that you might do. And we have put forward a hierarchy that differs from Bell's. The hierarchy of need is the smaller, the more the need, and the less vertically integrated, the more the need. And so Bell's proposal interested us. I would offer to comment more specifically and in detail on it in your February 15 final comments phase. But we do not believe that you can achieve what is necessary within the existing 5% BDU situation. I'm not sure it would have to go back up to 6.5 as it did, you may know, during the LPIF era. But in our mind, something in the range of 6% might be necessary. Otherwise, you're getting into some Hobson choices between various things that are important in themselves. I mentioned earlier the notion of BDUs getting a subsidy for community programming, but less than what amounts to 100% subsidy. And certainly we would favor you being more stringent in the large markets than in the smaller markets. General comments now. Is that okay?
And you draw the line, and rightly so, between the smaller operators, the independents, and the large vertically integrated firms. One of the parts of Bell's proposal was actually Bell would be one of the, if not the largest recipient of funds under that proposal as well, but did not commit to any new news programming as a result of that funding.
Yeah.
So when you're making your final comments, you may want to suggest how those funds could better be divided among non-vertically integrated providers.
I have in my notes here and cannot readily find a breakout of the beneficiaries, but I recall that Bell was way up in the 2-digit millions and that entities like Shaw and CBC were well down in the low one-digit millions, yes.
So if a fund is created, regardless of sort of what form it takes and where the money comes from, can you comment on who should administer the fund and how it should be administered so it is independent and can, preserve, journalistic integrity in its funding decisions to various stations and various markets?
I think I'd be doing you more of a service and facilitating the agenda by offering to comment on that by the 15th of February too, because that's a matter of some
The 5th of
detail.
February.
5th.
Undertakings are for
I'm
the
not
5th.
the first person you've reminded of that, Mr.
Yes,
Chair.
thank you.
Oh, yes. Yes. Almost got away with the 15th for a minute, though.
I'm sure someone on staff would have caught that before the final submission date. And just one final question, and it sort of jumps from the local stations back to the community stations. If we did look at, and you have suggested that perhaps they couldn't scale up to a level of being able to develop a sufficient quality and quantity of news programming. But if we tried to augment their funding by allowing them to sell advertising in their local markets to, allow them to channel any advertising dollars to locally relevant programming, what would your thoughts be on that?
I think I mentioned earlier that in many cases they have a rather modest market share of viewers at any given time. If somebody from the advertising business were here, and you asked them that question, they would want the numbers. So there's a possibility that it might be of some help. Possibility there's some niche advertisers who might benefit from that opportunity, but I think you should commission a study to identify the potential. I think it might be very modest and not in general terms anywhere near a solution to the problem.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
I believe legal has some questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have Exhibit 2, which I will ask the Secretary to provide you a copy of.
Thanks.
This exhibit contains a series of questions relating to the study's near-term prospects for local TV in Canada and Canadian television 2020 technological and regulatory impacts. The Commission doesn't expect you to provide an answer to these questions at the hearing, as they will require some thinking and legwork on your part, but we do ask that you undertake to provide responses as applicable by February 15th.
We would be delighted to do that.
Thank you.